the Midnight Ride and the shot heard round the world. That was the battles of Lexington and Concord. That was the beginning of the American Revolution. What was the Midnight Ride? Well, in the spring of 1775, the British were occupying Boston because that was a hotbed of patriot activity where the colonists hated these various tax acts that the Parliament was putting on the colonies in order to pay for certain things. They ostensibly pay for the French and Indian War, for example. And the colonists hated these taxes, and they got around them whenever they could. In addition to that, because tensions were riding high, we had even at this point the Boston Massacre, for example, the British decided to seize certain colonial militia weapons and supplies. They did it successfully the fall before, bloodlessly, and doing so would hamper the ability of the colonists to start a armed rebellion. So they wanted to do that again, this time at Concord. On the 18th of April, Paul Revere and William Dawes were notified that that was beginning to happen. The British were moving out of Boston to seize those weapons. And they rode out across the countryside to alert patriots that the British troops were moving. And they, not only would they try to seize those weapons, but also possibly arrest the leaders of the Sons of Liberty, who were kind of in hiding in Lexington, Samuel Adams and John Hancock. And thousands of patriots responded. They successfully alerted the whole countryside. They had done this in the past for various reasons as well, but this time it resulted in a shooting war called the Battles of Lexington and Concord. So who were the Sons of Liberty? They were Americans who fought politically for colonial rights with the motto, no taxation without representation. Starting with the Stamp Act of 1765. That was hated so much it was repealed in 1766, but the British Parliament came back and enacted additional acts. Patriots were any of the colonists who resisted British rule. Some of them were militiamen, some of them were regular citizens, some of them were sort of the elite of the militia, which were the Minutemen who were ready to go at a minute's notice. And some of them were the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty numbered in the hundreds, probably over 300, but it was a small core group that was in Boston that did most of the planning and were responsible for these activities on this night. Boston, again, was a hotbed of patriot activity. That resulted in the occupation of Boston as of 1768 and the Townshend Acts as well, these additional acts of Parliament. That occupation led to the Boston Massacre of 1770 because of the tensions. The soldiers involved in that were held to account and some of them punished for it. And that eased tensions a little bit for a while, but they ramped up again, especially with the Tea Act of 1773, and that triggered the Boston Tea Party of 1773. That was the Sons of Liberty. So when you think of Paul Revere, he's one of those guys that dressed up like a Native American and dumped the tea into Boston Harbor. They called it the destruction of the tea. It was years later before somebody thought of a much better name. The Boston Tea Party resulted in the Intolerable Acts of 1774. That was 5 more of these onerous acts that were meant to punish especially the Bostonians. And those Intolerable Acts then immediately led to the Patriots' response, which was the Suffolk Resolves of 1774. Those basically said, don't trade with the British, don't pay their taxes, don't obey the new laws or new officials, and don't let them dismantle our militias. Who were these people who were involved in this? Well, Samuel Adams was 53 years old in 1775. He was the founder of the Sons of Liberty in Boston. He was a colonial politician. He was a maltster by trade as a businessman, as his father was, but he was so obsessed with politics that his malt business kind of failed. That's the beginning of the brewing process for beer. The Samuel Adams beer is named for him, but it was only founded in 1984, so it doesn't really have a direct, it's just in honor of him. And he was also kind of a failed tax collector because if he didn't like the taxes, he just wouldn't collect them. And the British said, well, if you're not going to collect these taxes, you have to pay them yourself. And he ended up having to get bailed out by his rich friends. He objected to the direct taxation of the colonies by the British Parliament, where the colonies had no representation. That's taxation without representation. He thought that Parliament should ask the colonies for money, and the representatives of the people should be the ones putting the taxes on the people themselves, because they could be held accountable by the people. That was his political argument. He helped to draft those colonial responses to those various British acts, and as well as the Articles of Confederation, which was our first government, the Massachusetts Constitution, and the Declaration of Independence. He was one of the major founding fathers. He had 6 children by 2 wives. John Hancock was 39 years old in 1775. The 2 of them were kind of hiding out in Lexington. He funded the Sons of Liberty in Boston. He was the money man. And he lived with his uncle. His father died young, and his uncle was an importer, so he became an importer. And if you were an importer in colonial America, you were kind of automatically a smuggler, because Americans hated these taxes and they openly supported smuggling. You could get insurance against being caught smuggling in America. That's how much they hated it. He also was a big landowner. He was one of the richest guys among the founding fathers. He was also the longest serving president of the Continental Congress, and also later governor of Massachusetts. He objected, this will surprise you, the money man objected to taxation for economic reasons. He had 2 children, and you may remember him as being the guy who signed the Declaration of Independence real big. Not John Henry. John Henry was a steel driving man. I have to correct people on that sometimes. Dr. Joseph Warren was 34 years old in 1775. You probably don't remember his name. It's maybe because he didn't make it to the age of 35. He was the leader of the Sons of Liberty in Boston. And he directly, he organized the Midnight Ride. He was the one who wrote those Suffolk results of 1774 that made the British so mad. And he was a physician, as well as a politician, and he became an officer in the war as a general. He had 4 children. He also had this little spy network among the British officers. And but he learned that there was a British spy amongst the Sons of Liberty themselves, where they met at the Green Dragon Tavern. So they left, hoping it was somebody who frequented there or worked there, but they found out that even so, their plans were being known. So they discovered that it was somebody within the Sons of Liberty themselves who was actually a betrayer. They found out who it was. It was a doctor named Church, but unfortunately, he doesn't really feature into the story otherwise. He's just a shadowy figure in the spy versus spy part of the story at the beginning here. Paul Revere was 40 years old in 1775. He was the premier express rider among the Sons of Liberty. He had ridden out and alerted people before in various ways, and in numerous ways delivered messages and news as far as Philadelphia and New York. There were Sons of Liberty organizations in New York and Philadelphia, as well as Boston. And he was the son of French immigrants. His father's name was Paul Revere, so our Paul Revere is sometimes called Paul Revere Jr. He was a silversmith and an engraver. Some of his engravings were famous political things like the Boston Massacre and the occupation of Boston, with Boston Harbor full of British ships. He later became a lieutenant colonel in the Army and an industrialist. I'll talk about that at the end. He was bold and confident, maybe brash even, and an excellent horseman. He was known to the British. Again, they had spies. They knew who these guys were. And he had 16 children by 2 wives, 8 with the first one and 8 with the second. Of course, as you know, back then, a lot of these children lived to adulthood. William Dawes is the other express rider in our story. And he was 30 years old in 1775 and a tanner. He was a militiaman and became a major. He was a quartermaster during the war. And he was also instrumental in acquiring and moving artillery. Again, anybody can get their hands on guns, but if you've got artillery, you've got an army. He had 7 children by 2 wives. Now, Dr. Samuel Prescott here is the one guy who doesn't have a nice fancy portrait. And unfortunately, that's because I think this is probably what he looked like, something like this. He was 24 years old in 1775. He would not survive the war and be able to sit for a nice portrait. But he was an impromptu express rider. He was not a member of the Sons of Liberty, and we're going to learn how he joined and became a real hero. He was a physician, probably became an army doctor, and it was childless. On the British side, General Thomas Gage was the guy who was the general of the army in the Americas, who was giving most of the orders, sending people out. Not a field leader, but in Boston itself, and running his own little spying operation. He was previously friendly with George Washington. They had served in the French and Indian War. Like I said, many of these officers knew each other and were rather friendly with one another. There were incidents of them stopping their men from bayoneting each other in battles and stuff. Out of respect. His wife, Margaret, they were dedicated to each other. They had 11 children. She was an American, American-born, and she was suspected by her husband's officers of being a spy for the Patriots. We don't know if that is true, but we do know that he was paranoid about a spy in his midst, and it hampered his ability to communicate with his officers because of it. He felt an extra layer of secrecy in what he was doing. Now the places, the 12 minutes in. Boston. Pretty much all of this is Boston today, or suburbs of Boston. But back in 1775, only that little peninsula right in the middle is the city of Boston. Separated from Roxbury by what they call Boston Neck, which is a little isthmus that you had to ride in and out. That's the one if by land route. And then the two if by sea route is taking boats across the river to like Brookline or Cambridge, and or as Paul Revere would do, across to Charlestown. And all of this, you see all of these small islands in the Boston Harbor. That's because this is very low-lying land and very marshy, and that was a major factor in the British ability to use their boats to get across. And today, you can see that that is largely filled in. It was reclaimed as, and developed as land. You can see, I think you can see it better on this one, Lexington up in the northwest, and Concord a little further west of that. It's only about 12 miles from Charlestown, where Revere would start his ride, and Lexington, and another 7 or so miles to Concord. Here's the city of Boston. Boston Neck is down at the bottom, and the North Church, the famous North Church, is up in the upper right, and Charlestown is across the river. That's where Revere would go. And down here in the lower left is the encampment of the British regular army, what they call the regulars, on Boston Common. A couple of brigades, 2 or 3,000 men. Here's what that looks like today. You can see, again, how much that's filled in. All of this around here, immediately around it is filled in, including the mill pond and so on. Although Boston Common is still there. So the actual events of the day, 15 minutes. Events leading up to the ride. Both sides tried to avoid a war. They didn't want to go to war. They didn't want to. Each side didn't want to be blamed for it. Once it started, each side blamed the other for starting it. And so again, many involved were actually friends or friendly, or at least respected one another. Thomas Gage's troops had seized weaponry back in 1774 bloodlessly, and they wanted to do that again to try to, again, reduce the colonists' ability to fight a war if it came to that. But of course, it triggered the war, so it was a kind of a bad plan. The Patriot response to that had been haphazard. They had ridden out and done very much like they had done here, but because the British had not shot anybody, it didn't develop into a shooting war. They all kind of dissipated, and they wanted to avoid repeating that, so they were a little more careful this time. Thousands of Patriots rushed to Boston at that time. In February of 1775, a little bit before our story of the night, the British government declared Massachusetts to be in a state of rebellion in response to the Suffolk Resolve. Not armed rebellion, but like political rebellion. If you're not going to pay taxes and obey laws, then you're rebelling by us. And that's why Gage was ramped up his activities. Joseph Warren, Dr. Joseph Warren, the leader of in Boston of the Patriots, sent Revere to Concord to warn the Patriots to move their weapons and supplies, because his spies had learned that their spies had learned where those weapons and supplies were hidden in Concord, and they wanted to move them. So on the night, Revere was not concerned so much about that seizure. His main mission was alerting Hancock and Adams that the British were on the march and they could be arrested. Although it turns out that was not Gage's purpose. Gage had orders from the Secretary of State for the Colonies, who was the Earl of Dartmouth, that's the representative of the Crown in the colonies, to seize weapons and supplies and arrest rebel leaders at his discretion. And he wanted to avoid antagonizing them and did not give orders to do that. In fact, his orders for his soldiers were basically don't make a mess, don't shoot anybody if you don't have to. Pay for food in order to feed your men on these missions and stuff like that. Don't just don't seize things that you don't have to. He also ordered his troops to go on these harmless route marches where he thought if he got his troops marching around the colony, people would get used to it. Then when he had to make this kind of a move, that they wouldn't react as much. It turns out that they hated the idea of British soldiers marching around the colony, whether or not they were shooting anybody. So it did not help. Events immediately prior to the night in question. Warren and Revere made a plan with William Dawes and patriots in Charlestown to ride all over Massachusetts colony to make that alert the way they had done in the past. For years, even back before the French and Indian War, they had used this system, a relay system of alerting each other. Revere then made a plan with Robert Newman, who was the sexton of the North Church, to signal the patriots in Charlestown with lanterns in case Revere was arrested for trying to cross the river after dark. So this is something that the Longfellow poem gets wrong. That the lanterns in the spire of the Old North Church were Revere's signal to those people in case he couldn't get over to make the ride. So that was the beginning of him signaling people to start riding out themselves. There were about 40 people who ended up ultimately riding out far and wide, and thousands who ended up coming to Concord or somewhere on the road between Boston and Concord. But they were afraid. There was a curfew, and the ferry shut down at 9 o'clock. There was a gate at Boston Neck that William Dawes had to get through in order to get out, and that was a factor in all of this plan. For their part, the British part, Gage made a plan to send soldiers to Concord ahead of his troops and sort of hide them off the road so that when darkness fell, they could come out and arrest people and try to hamper the colonists from being able to do this communication. But unfortunately for him, just putting the soldiers out there put the militia on high alert. They wanted to know why are these guys walking around today? So it really didn't help. Although Revere and Dawes knew that there was a pretty good chance that they would be arrested because they were going to run into these guys eventually, they thought. Gage also quietly prepared for about 750 soldiers to move soon out of Boston Common and go to march to Concord. For them, about 12 or 15 miles. About 17 miles all over, including Lexington and then Concord. However, the launch and landing sites were disastrously chosen. They went at night at low tide. That was a very marshy area, so the men they couldn't get the boats right up next to the shore, so the men had to wade through the marshy water and the marsh grasses and whatnot up to their shirt fronts in order to get into the boats. And then they didn't go straight across. They went to this other place because they wanted to keep it secret where exactly they were going to land. And they had to do the same thing once they landed, and it was terrible. That was one of the biggest mistakes that the British made. Both sides made some mistakes, but for the most part, it was very good military leadership. The start of the ride itself, that night, the April 18th of 1775, sometime before 9 p.m., Joseph Warren notified William Dawes that the soldiers seemed to be moving. Dawes had to ride out immediately to get out of the gate before curfew fell, which was probably 9:30 or so. Again, the ferry was stopped at 9 o'clock, so it must have been 9:30 or so. He just ambled through the city from the north all the way down to the south to avoid attention, and then out the gate and before it closed. And so he only had half the information. It looks like those guys are on the move, and we don't know exactly what else is going to happen. For his part, Gage's another major mistake was that he failed to detain Warren and Revere, or even have them watched. If Paul Revere had been followed by 2 soldiers, let's say, he wouldn't have been able to go to Warren's house to get this information, to go to the North Church to tell the guys to set the lantern, or to get across the river himself. So none of that would have worked, and only William Dawes would have alerted the patriots. And what in his mind, he was mainly just going to Lexington to notify Hancock and Adams that something was up. They didn't have the whole story. So that would have really hampered the patriots. About 10 p.m. then, Warren summoned Revere to his house and told him that he had personally witnessed boats being loaded. So now they knew that this was the night that they were making the move to Concord, and that they were going by boats, and they thought that would be a faster thing. So the patriots were really keyed up. It turned out to be much slower. Revere then had the sexton and 2 pals sort of working lookout, set 2 lamps in the church spire to it by sea. But it was only there for about a minute. The sexton brought them up together and then separated them like this, hoping that would be very clear signal. But they didn't. This is a failing of the Patriots. They didn't have a return signal. Nobody else had a light in Charleston to indicate that they had received the message. So he only had it up for a minute, fearing that somebody would notice and they would get arrested. And then came down. Meanwhile, while they were doing that, Revere went to his house, stopped by his house, got his boots and his overcoat. And he didn't know this mission was going to happen tonight. He was wearing his fancy buckle shoes, right? So he gets his riding boots and his overcoat, and he goes to the river where he's got a couple of other friends with a boat hidden, and they sneak across the river in the dark, under the looming shadow of the HMS Somerset and her guns, the man of war. And he estimates that it was 11 p.m. when he made Charlestown, and he found out that, in fact, those other patriots had got his initial signal and were already riding out themselves. And then he has to borrow a horse, because he did bring a horse across the river, and it was a very good horse that he was able to borrow, and he was very pleased with it. Brown Beauty was her name. Here's a map of the road to Lexington. You see Revere in blue going out to the north. Well, first let's start with Dawes, because he went out earlier. He goes out Boston Neck and through Roxbury and Brookline, he comes out. And he didn't alert very many patriots, but the ones that he did took up the loose planks on Cambridge Bridge in order to slow down the British if they went that way. It actually turned out to be the other way around, because the British tried to go that way on the way back. You see the British coming out of almost Boston back up to Lechmere Point, where they didn't go straight across. It was a terrible idea. You see in blue, Revere going through Charlestown, past Breeds Hill and Bunker Hill, out Charlestown Neck, and then he starts to go south, but he runs into a British patrol, 2 men, and they chase him. So he takes instead a route up to Medford, and then comes back down south. And he was afraid that delay might cause a problem, but it turned out not to. And then on to Lexington. Here is that route today, if you would like to maybe ride it on a bicycle or a horse. There are 7 Milk and Donuts along the way. About 12 miles of actual riding. Revere was able to do it in about an hour. Yes. There were taverns along the way too, and they looked a lot like houses. You'll see Buckman Tavern in a minute, so when he says he alerted houses, he probably also meant taverns, because again, the Minutemen and the Patriots were on high alert, and they went to the taverns to talk about it. The road to Lexington itself, Revere first had to avoid arrest at this execution spot. There was a strap iron what do you call it, a gibbet that contained a skeleton that had been, it was an executed man that had been there for 20 years. So it was a very well-known landmark. And there he saw this very picturesque moment in his memoirs, where with the moon was bright. It was a very nice night in April. The trees still don't have leaves, so it was a very good visual area, but also made it hard for the Patriots to hide when they wanted to ambush somebody. And then that's where he saw two soldiers. One of them moved away to cut him off if he tried to run, and the other came at him. Well, he turned his horse immediately and went the other way. And as he made the turn for Medford Road, that soldier tried to cut him off by going through the brush and ended up getting stuck in a pond. And so he raced that first 4 miles to Medford, not alerting anybody, basically full gallop. When he got to Medford, he alerted the Minuteman captain. He knew all of these guys pretty well. And so even though this was not the route he'd intended, he knew who to alert in Medford. Woke the guy up and told him that the regulars are out. The regulars are coming out, and that Patriots should assemble in Concord. He did not say the British are coming because they were all British subjects. The regulars, again, means regular army soldiers. The militiamen were called irregulars. What he would do, because from there he raced on and alerted almost every house along the way, just kept known loyalist houses. But the idea was that he would race up, hop off his horse, go up and knock very loud and shout, the regulars are coming out, the Patriots should assemble in Concord. And if it was a loyalist house, they would just disregard the message. They didn't feel the need to get their guns and go back up the British army. But if they were patriots, they themselves would ride out and tell their friends and neighbors and join. And that worked very, very well. On the British side, the main body of Gage's troops, again, about 750 men, were bogged down in their crossing for hours, from about 9 p.m., maybe earlier when they initially started, all the way to 2 a.m. before they actually assembled at Lechmere Point on the other side of the river, and were able to start their march to Lexington and Concord because of those marshy conditions at low tide. So Revere gets to Lexington about midnight, alerting all these houses along the way. This is Buckman Tavern here. You can see how much it looks like an ordinary house, kind of. And he went to Hancock Clark House. This was the home of some of Hancock's family, where Hancock and Samuel Adams were kind of hiding out with the family, and which included Hancock's fiance. And they had just gone to bed. In fact, the guard tried to shush Revere when he rode up, and he said, "You're going to have plenty of noise coming very soon. You should wake him up." And Hancock stuck his head out of the window and said, "Oh, Paul Revere, come on in, we're not afraid of you." He was surprised that Dawes had not beat him there, but Dawes had a slow horse, and he was probably not galloping from house to house. He was not the express rider that Revere was, but he did show up about half an hour after Revere did. And Adams and Hancock start packing to leave and discussing what they're going to do. They've got another place that they could hide out in another town nearby. And then Revere and Dawes say, okay, we're going to go on to Concord to let them know that even though there are no weapons there to be seized, that the British are on their way to cause some trouble there, and we want the whole colony to be alerted. So this is again 12:30, 12:45 or so. Buckman Tavern was full. There were people in there talking about what was going on. The Patriots, some of the Patriots kind of got tired of waiting. It took the British so long to get there after they'd known about it. The Patriots were way ahead of them. So now it is close to 1 a.m. The soldiers that I had mentioned had been sent out to arrest people after dark. Had long made their little hideout at Concord and hidden just off the road. There were a couple of them sort of right on the road, a couple of them hidden just off the road. There were several more hidden in a copse of trees in a pasture well off the road. The conditions at that time in Massachusetts, especially in this area, was that there weren't a lot of places to hide. It wasn't like forested so much. Had been settled for a couple of hundred years now, and well, for 150 years or so. And it was mostly farms and pastures and fields and that sort of thing. That's going to factor very well in later on in the story. And it was about 1 a.m., just about 15 minutes out of Lexington, that Revere and Dawes were overtaken by Dr. Samuel Prescott, that 24-year-old doctor who was on his way home at 1 a.m. Now, they did not know him. He wasn't one of the Sons of Liberty. He wasn't a member of the militia or the Minutemen or anything like that. You might ask, what is a young doctor like this doing out in the middle of the night if he is not one of these people? And the answer is that he was on his way home from his girlfriend's house. The kind of girlfriend that lets you stay after midnight. So, and he knew this road very well. He had, make his own midnight rides on a number of occasions. And so he says, let me help you with this. These people know me. I know this road very well. And they start showing him how to alert the people in the houses as they go. A couple of them would go to one house and alert them while the other one went to the next house, and then they would catch up and they would go so they could go faster than they had before. At one point when Revere was out in front, he noticed men standing by the road very similarly to what he saw earlier. A couple of guys loitering there who looked very suspicious, and he went, okay, the jig's up. And he alerted Prescott and Dawes, but as soon as he did that, they'd start writing themselves. But as soon as he does that, the four more come up from two on each side of the road, come out of hiding and grab him and grab Prescott at the same time. And they force the two of them into, they've got a gate there, into a pasture. And Dawes, on the other hand, he immediately turned around and started going the other way, racing back toward Lexington. So, and he did something very smart. The two that were following him on horses, as he approached a farmhouse, he shouted, "Hello, boys! I got two of them!" And they held up they arrested themselves and raced back because they thought they were going into an ambush. But in fact, it was just a trick. Unfortunately for him, his horse reared and threw him, and he ended up. That's kind of the end of his night. He was limping back to Lexington, I think. Meanwhile, as Prescott and Revere got into the pasture, they immediately bolted in different directions. Prescott leaped over a low stone wall and headed toward Concord, and he got away. And Revere headed toward a copse of trees that seemed like a good place that might get away. Remember when I said that there were several more soldiers hiding in the copse of trees in a pasture? They immediately stepped up and grabbed him. So they threatened him with a pistol, and they quickly figured out who he was. He was a known quantity among, again, there was a spy among the Sons of Liberty. And so they demanded information from him about what he was doing, and he told them basically everything because he was very proud of himself, because basically they had already beaten the British that night. He told them that, you have missed your shot, and this whole countryside has been alarmed, and it will soon be filled with 500 militia. So they they took him on they took his horse by the reins and led him back to Lexington. And as they got near Lexington, they started hearing alarm gunfire and bells. There was a bell in Lexington Green. And they start getting frightened. And he sort of taunts them, saying that you guys are going to get killed tonight because this place is going to be filled with patriots. So they get genuinely frightened, and they release their prisoners. They abandon them on foot. They take their horses and head back to their commanders to let him know. So Revere goes back to, walks back the rest of the way to Hancock Clark House and finds that Hancock and Clark, it's now like 3 a.m. They're still packing. They haven't left. In fact, Hancock is like cleaning his gun. Like he's thinking maybe he's going to fight the British. And so Adams and Revere kind of have to prevail upon him. Did I mention he's not the brains of the operation, he's the money man. and they have to kind of prevail upon him to go ahead and get out of town, so that otherwise it kind of undoes Dawes and Revere's hard work that evening, alerting them. And so they do in fact do that, and Revere goes with them, but he and Hancock's assistant decide to come back to Lexington. So now it's 4:30 a.m. and there are people saying that the British troops are marching down the road toward the town. They can see them now, and they get the assistant says, "Hey, you know what? We actually forgot a big heavy trunk in the second floor of Buckman Tavern that's full of like secret documents and stuff. So let's grab that." And they have to kind of walk that past Lexington Green, where they see 50 militiamen have assembled. The local militiamen have assembled on Lexington Green, but only a very small number of them, 50 of them. And so they hie it out of town. It's 5 a.m. now, and Revere starts hearing. He hears the gunfire that happens in Lexington Square when the British arrive. Prescott has alerted many patriots on the way to Concord. He alerts Concord itself. He goes past the South Bridge and continues to ride out. He may have ridden just as far as Dawes and Revere ultimately that night, and alerts the countryside beyond that. And he is probably instrumental in how many patriots actually made it to Concord. Revere helped them pack and get out of town. So, the battles of Lexington and Concord. This is the shot heard around the world. That's the end of the midnight ride. You can leave now if that's all you do. It does get exciting here. This is now the action movie part. Here's a British grenadier. They were a mix of grenadiers and regular infantry, light infantry. Shortly before 5 a.m., Revere and Hancock's assistant returned to get that. They just wanted to look around, then they remembered about that trunk, and got out of town. And about 5 a.m. then, the British advance force of 250 marched into town, and they found those militiamen assembled on Lexington Green, and they decided to disperse them for whatever reason. Somebody fired some shots, nobody knows who. It was not an official order to fire, but they fired on the militia and then charged them with bayonets. 8 were killed immediately and 10 were wounded, including an enslaved black man who was allowed to join the militia. It was a peculiar institution. So they did disperse those 50 militiamen, and then by that, they actually started to go kind of crazy, and they were shooting at spectators and everything. And it was when the Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith arrived with the rest of his full 750 men that they were able to get control of them and reform the column and march for Concord. The column of 750 soldiers. Oh, by the way, only one British soldier was even wounded in that exchange. So again, maybe not the Americans' fault. That column of 750 was about 300 yards long. These are narrow country roads really, and that factors into the ending of our story very importantly. So they march for Concord. Here is Concord town. And you see they're going to come in from the east and into the town itself, and they're going to secure the south bridge, and then also up to the north bridge. Their intelligence, their spies had told them that most of the weapons and supplies were stored at Barrett's Farm, way over there, number 9 on the far left. And so that was their main goal. They were also searching the town itself in general. And by the time they got there, 9 a.m., about 400 patriots, three or 400 patriots had assembled. And the patriots stood off. You see this hill where I have North Bridge. Right below that is a hill where they could stand, they could see the bridge, but they couldn't quite see into the town itself. And that's where the militiamen assembled. 300 or 400, not enough to take on 750 British soldiers, but enough to keep an eye on them and maybe keep them honest about what they were doing, to make sure that they weren't going to make too much of a mess. Here's a light infantry. The British marched that several miles to Concord, and the militiamen gathered by the hundreds. And watched them as they started to search. The British found very little, but they found like 550 pounds of musket balls, which they dumped into the mill pond. But the colonists were able, once they left, the colonists were able to fish it out and still use those musket balls. So that didn't matter very much. But they also found gun carriages. The Patriots had a couple of big 24-pounder siege guns that were not practical for field use. They did have some 3-pounder artillery pieces that they could have used on this night, to be honest. That might be a mistake, that on the Patriot side, they were trying to hide these guns so much that it didn't occur to them that a battle might occur where they could use those cannons. So they started burning those gun carriages, and the Patriots on the hill, who couldn't see very well, started to think that they were starting to burn the town down, and they were going to set fire to the town. So they marched down in formation to the bridge, where there was a smaller force holding the north bridge, and now they overwhelmed that force. And that became, again, one of those situations where who knows who started shooting, but there was an exchange there, and several were killed, maybe 10 or 15 at least were killed on both sides. And the British force rushed back into the town to the main force. That left the guys at Barrett's farm very vulnerable, but the militia decided, again, this is not a war yet, so if they're going to stop shooting at us, we're going to stop shooting at them, and they backed off to the hill again. And the British at Barrett's farm were able to get back into Lexington and organize themselves. And Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith of the British Army decided that the better part of valor was to eat lunch and form up and march out, give up on this failed mission, and not antagonize the colonists too much more. It was noontime now at this point. They had been marching for 17 miles and had 2 small battles, and now they had to march all the way back empty-handed. It was a difficult day for them. This, however, started a running battle all the way from Concord back to Lexington, where what happened, the militia decided to follow them, and they went around can you see it in this one? Yeah. They went around this big sort of L-shaped hill on the northeast side of Concord and cut them off as they got there. And the problem with a 300-yard long column of soldiers is that if you're hiding among trees and barns and those low stone walls that are all over New England, you've got maybe 6 minutes to, even with a musket, you can fire off several shots in 6 minutes before that column has marched by. And it was amazing that the British could even keep themselves together under that kind of treatment. Hundreds of, at this point, 500, 600 soldiers or militiamen have gathered and start following them along the road and harassing them, getting into the rocks and trees. And sometimes the British would, so they would fire at them from like a farmhouse, and the British would send a group of men over to attack the farmhouse and roust out the people in there, stuff like that. All the way back 7 miles to Lexington. The British were absolutely exhausted by this. Where are we? Here we are. They were absolutely exhausted by this by the time this is now 17 miles plus another 7. So 24 miles is a long march for a day. They were out of ammunition, the British were, and they were deathly afraid, definitely in danger of being routed or having to surrender. Even though they'd only lost maybe 30 or 40 men, they'd had to leave their dead behind. And when they got to, again, it would have been nice to have the 3-pounder cannons pointed up and down the road at some point. But when they got to Lexington, they got the reprieve that saved them completely from being completely wiped out. And that is that Gage had sent Brigadier General Hugh Percy with a 1,000-man brigade. So more than the original force out of Boston, and they had met Smith's almost brigade at Lexington and saved them. They actually brought 2 cannons with them, 2 6-pounder cannons. They were able to point those down the road and clear the road of Patriots So the Patriots had to stay off the road in the pastures and fields and whatnot. That force of 1,700 then began another even bloodier, bigger running battle in the march back to Boston. Again, still being harassed by the militiamen, but now it's 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, maybe 5,000 militiamen by the time they get back to Boston. They actually go the northern route to Charlestown. Worse for them, Joseph Warren, again, the leader of the Sons of Liberty, had come out of Boston himself and was met by Brigadier General William Heath of the Massachusetts militia. I think the highest ranking officer that the militia had up to this point was a colonel. Otherwise, they were mostly just led by their local captains. So they were a bit more tentative than they otherwise would have been. Well, Joseph Warren would become a general later. So these two generals basically started directing the militia much more efficiently into this like moving ring that was able to follow along as that long British column, this is now maybe 600 yards, would march through the countryside, and they could continue firing at them all the way back to Charlestown, another, again, 10 miles or 12 miles to Charlestown. It was an exhausting time. However, Percy and his two 6-pounder cannons were again able to clear the road both ahead and behind as they went from time to time in order to at least keep the Patriots off the road and having to walk through the farms themselves. He used his last cannon shots to clear the Patriots at Prospect Hill outside Charlestown at dusk. He came that close. The Patriots could have wiped out the whole 1,700-man force. That's Lexington and Concord. The events immediately following. So Percy and Smith's troops barely made it back to Charlestown under the protective guns of the HMS Somerset. Once they got to Charlestown, they were able to get into their own fortifications, and the Patriots couldn't advance any further. What they did was they sat down and started the siege of Boston. The British had lost 273 casualties, about 100 of them were dead, and the Americans lost 90, and about 50 of those were dead. Smith's troops had marched 17 miles to Concord and back 34 miles in nearly 24 hours, with 8 hours being under fire. It was an exhausting experience. The American militiamen collected, the American leaders collected militiamen testimonies and sent them on a fast ship to England to beat General Gage's official report. They wanted to get into the British newspapers and get their American point of view, and it worked very well. Gage's official report, when it came, was quite vague because it was very embarrassing. This was a terrible, not a defeat so much, but it was more or less a defeat for the British. But of course, it was supposed to be a peacekeeping mission. It was supposed to stop a war from happening, and instead it started a war. So the siege of Boston began immediately on April 19, this is the next day, obviously, and it lasted almost a year, March 17, 1776, before the British were forced out of Boston by ship. The Second Continental Congress immediately created the Continental Army, May 4, 1775, and they sent George Washington to Boston to take command of the militia, which was at that point about 15,000 men arrayed around Boston in the siege. And that was the beginning of the Continental Army. But he needed help turning them into soldiers, because even though those sort of French and Indian war techniques of fighting from off-road and what we would call guerrilla tactics worked in this case, it would not work in other cases. They had done some training in their, marching in lines and firing and then kneeling and reloading and bayonets and that sort of thing. They had that training, but they needed better and more formal training. That's where Casimir Pulaski and Marquis de Lafayette and von Steuben came in to help. He started, of course, with Benjamin Franklin. Not a military man, but smart, so everybody asked his opinion of everything. Francis Smith and Hugh Percy, the British officers, they were promoted. But Gage was sent back to England. The Battle of Bunker Hill occurred a couple of months later. That was a British victory, but it was very, very costly for them. And so that additional embarrassment meant that Gage was replaced by Howe, General Howe. Dr. Joseph Warren, the leader of the Sons of Liberty, was commissioned as a Major General, but he died at the Battle of Bunker Hill. And William Dawes was commissioned as a Major, became a Quartermaster, and Paul Revere was commissioned as a Lieutenant Colonel in the Navy and put in charge of artillery on river. In later life, Revere lived quite a long life. In later life, he started an iron foundry and also America's first copper mill. And that company that he started is still in business. They used to make Revere ware, the copper bottom pots and pans that were quite popular. That's still his business. Sam Adams is just an honorary name, but Revere ware is Paul Revere. There it is. Are there questions? Are there any questions? The name of the horse was Brown Beauty.
Are there any other discrepancies between the coin and factual?
Yes, he never mentions Robert Dawes, for one thing, or really the other men who rode out. And again, the main thing I would say is that he mistakenly says that the lanterns were for Revere when it was Revere's signal to the other riders. Yeah.
What was the name of the gentleman, Howe?
General, I think it's William Howe,
Oh.
who took over from Thomas Gage.
Was there a connection between General Howe and the former Howe Military School in Howe, Indiana?
Oh, that I don't know. Oh, no, I can't imagine.
It's no longer, but
Yeah. Okay. H-O-W-E.
yes, yeah, that's how it's spelled.
All those guys were aristocrats. That's how you got to become an officer in the British military. And Hugh Percy became the Duke of Northumberland, one of the richest, very richest men in England. His brother was James Smithson. If that name rings a bell, it's because when James Smithson died, he bequeathed his entire fortune to the United States for science, which became the Smithsonian Institution. When the family wanted to, the British just chucked Dr. Warren's body into a hole with another patriot. But when the family dug him up, they wanted to give him a proper burial. They needed to identify which body was his. Paul Revere identified the body by the silver and ivory bridge that he had manufactured for Warren himself. That was the first, at least in the US, that was the first example of forensic dentistry, identifying a body by its dental work, teeth. Paul Revere. It was a weird time.
Got another question?
Yes?
I wanted to ask about how the colonists got things now. Did Britain still send stuff to America, or where did we get our things from? Was it France or what?
It was France for the most part, yes. There were smugglers as well, bringing things in from Britain after the war started, even though despite the boycott. Yeah. And there were other countries that were not friends of Britain who also helped out, sending the experts, military officers, and that sort of thing, and they were willing to sell America supplies and whatnot.
Any other questions? Thank you, Derek.